Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a look at the image quality from this new Canon 70-200mm f4L IS Mark II. And as I mentioned previously, I do still have on hand the Tamron 70-210mm f4 VC lens, and so obviously that's a pretty natural competitor. Both new lenses, both sharing similar maximum aperture and essentially similar focal length. Yes, the Tamron's 10 millimeters long. We'll break how that plays out in the as we look at some images together. And so first of all, I do want to note that yes, the Tamron competes at a different price point, and I've kind of detailed already in my first look episode where I break down the build quality and do some quick comparison there. You can check that episode out here. But in that video, I do note that the Canon lens does have a number of features and elements in it that do set it apart in terms of, I think, competing at appropriately a higher price point. You're gonna have to determine for yourself whether or not it's that much higher, however. And so, of course, in the US market, Tamron is $7.99, Canon is $12.99. And so let's look at some images together. We're gonna check out resolution. And so looking at these very quickly here, one thing that we do note is that the Canon has elected to go with a slightly slower shutter speed, so a little bit more exposure, roughly a third stop here. And looking at the images at large, it's hard to see much of a difference between them in terms of the actual exposure value. I kind of hoped with the slightly larger front diameter, moving from 67 to 72 millimeters, that we would actually see the opposite there. And so far I'm not seeing it, but we'll keep our eye out for that. So just taking a quick look at a few metrics here globally, there's not a whole lot to separate these two lenses when it comes to a vignette. You can see a fairly standard pattern with some light fall off towards the corners of the frame. As far as the actual distortion, I think that the Tamron has a slightly more pronounced amount of barrel distortion there, but it is by a very small margin at best. And so not really a huge win for either lens. Now, looking in the center of the frame here, both of them look pretty good. However, I do think that we'll see a little bit more detail and contrast out of the Canon lens, and you can just definitely see, like for example here, the shadows are a little bit deeper, and there's just a little bit more of that texture that is showing up. Looking to the edge of the frame at 70 millimeters f4, we find that once again this holds true, that it's a little bit stronger for the Canon. It's not a big margin, but it's mildly stronger. If we move up into the very extreme corner, you'll see that again it's a mild improvement for the Canon lens. Now both of these are delivering a good centering result. I'm just going to show you this corner just so you see it. We'll mostly look at the other side throughout the rest of the comparison because the light is a little more even there. But once again, we see that both of them are roughly equal in terms of sharpness on either side, and so not really a whole lot to distinguish there. So here, stop down to f5.6 at 70 millimeters. We see that definitely some vignette has lifted. The images look brighter. And that at 70 millimeters, we see the same exposure pattern that is taking place there. Now, in terms of sharpening up, I would say that the Canon has continued its trend of just being a little bit sharper. It looks really, really crisp now at f5.6 in the center of the frame. The Tamron lags behind, but not by much of a margin. I would say at the edge of the frame, the difference is less pronounced, and I wouldn't say that there is enough of a difference there to really see for any kind of field purposes. And so at f5.6, and really I would say at 70 millimeters at large, there is the slightest advantage for the Canon, but not very pronounced. Now, if we move on to 100 millimeters, and by the way, this is these comparisons are being shot on a Canon 5D Mark IV, so 30 megapixels of resolution. Looking at the images globally, once again, same things that we saw before, a little bit faster shutter speed for the Tamron lens, and but roughly a similar amount of exposure value there, and so kind of the opposite of what I expected to see. In terms of the distortion pattern, it's very, very minimal on both lenses, and so there's little distortion to see here. Vignette, I would say, is a little more mild at 100 millimeters. I'm sure it'll clear up a little bit, but there's not a ton there to look at. Now, in terms of our resolution, both of these lenses are actually looking pretty fabulous right in the center of the frame. And if there is a Canon advantage here, it's within the margin of error, probably not enough that you're going to see in field conditions. Looking off towards the side of the frame, got a slight advantage here to the Canon at the very edge of the frame, but as you can see, it's really not by much of a margin. And if we move off into the very extreme corner, the Canon holds up at that very, very extreme corner, kind of this last, few percent of the image frame. Looks better, looks softer here on the Tamron. Stopping down to f5.6, we see a nice even illumination across the frame with both lenses. I'll also point out that it seems to me like the color is fairly close with both lenses. Not a huge difference in the color temperature between the two lenses. Now, looking at the center of the frame, both lenses, again, are looking roughly equal off on the side of the frame. I would say that the same is true, and we'll look right up at that extreme corner once again. And, the Tamron has made some strides there. I would say the Canon still has the edge in the extreme corner. At 135 millimeters, the same patterns that we've been seeing are true when it comes to exposure value. You will see that there's a little bit more pronounced vignette here, and I would say that it's a little heavier on the Canon than it is on the Tamron at 135 millimeters. Both of them exhibit a mild bit of pincushion distortion. However, I would say it's slightly more pronounced on the Canon than what it is on the Tamron. Now, looking at the overall sharpness, I found this to be the sharpest point in focal range for the Tamron, and you can see that that bears true here. It looks really, really good, and both lenses, I would say, look equally excellent center of the frame. Off at the side, the Tamron, it looks just as good as the Canon, and I will note, and I'm actually really surprised by this, that the Tamron, even though it is using a faster shutter speed, it actually looks brighter here at the edge of the frame, and so less affected by vignette, I am assuming here. In the very, very edge, once again, the Canon's sharpness carries off into the extreme corner. However, if you move out any at all, the Tamron actually looks a little bit better because of the reduced vignette. Now at f5.6, this is the first time that we're seeing that the camera has exposed equally with both lenses. We can see the peripheral illumination is better, although you will see that there's still some vignette lingering on the Canon that is not there on the Tamron. Again, that's the exact opposite of what I thought would be the case. In terms of our sharpness and contrast, both of them look fantastic, extremely sharp here at the center of the frame. Off on the edge of the frame, once again, they both look really fantastic. 135 millimeters is definitely a strong part of the focal range for both lenses. So here we arrive at what is arguably the most important focal length in this focal range at 200 or 210 millimeters. And so now we see once again exposure value is identical, and the Tamron has shifted to the Canon's exposure value pattern. Now, a few things to note here. Obviously at 210 millimeters, the Tamron lens, as you can see, is framing a little bit tighter than what the Canon is. For example, you see this seam on the Canon. It's just not there on the Tamron lens. And so definitely as far as focus breathing goes, neither one of them is exhibiting any kind of apparent focus breathing. And in this case, the 210 millimeters of the Tamron lens is justified. It definitely frames tighter. Now you can see on both of these lenses that there is definitely some vignette that is creeping fairly far into the frame on both of them, and so that's certainly something to look out for. Now, as far as the sharpness center of the frame, here is where the Canon distinguishes itself. And you can see that it definitely is delivering better contrast and better resolution than what the Tamron is. And so you can see how this kind of grout line, lots of great detail there. And those details are definitely a whole lot mushier on the Tamron lens. Now out at the edge of the frame, that difference is there but less pronounced, and you can see there's just a little bit more micro contrast in the texture information, but it's not as pronounced as it was at the center. Extreme corner once again favors the Canon over the Tamron. So stopping down to f5.6, and here's what I observed previously when I reviewed the Tamron, in that it didn't make a whole lot of gains on the long end even when stopped down. And that is borne out here in that the the Canon lens has gone to what I would call really exceptional levels of detail, contrast, resolution. It all looks really, really fantastic there. The Tamron looks pretty soft by comparison. In an absolute sense, it's not bad, but the Canon is definitely much better. And that's true in terms of the contrast, even out at the edge of the frame now. Looking up this way, we can just see that there are more fine detail that is rendered there by the Canon lens. So definitely a win at the telephoto end of the focal length for Canon. So as you can see, the lenses are pretty close throughout a lot of the focal range. The Canon is a little better towards the edges and particularly in the extreme corners, but probably not a significant difference for you until you get to the long end of the focal range, which to me is the most important end of the focal range. And there we find that the Canon is significantly better wide open. Beyond that, however, it continues to be much better even stopped down. And so if your interest is shooting on the telephoto end of a lens like this, certainly the Canon, that extra degree of performance may be worth it to you. Now, of course, the one challenge for Canon is that at this particular price point, it doesn't compete necessarily directly with the Tamron, or at least the 70 to 210, but really price-wise, it competes with Tamron's 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 G2 lens, which obviously puts you in a completely different category. So let's look at how those lenses compete optically. F2.8 version has the advantage of letting in literally twice as much light as an f4 lens does. So we can see at f2.8 versus f4, 70 millimeters, that these lenses are very, very similar in their performance. At the very edge of the frame, the G2 lens is ever so slightly sharper, even at f2.8. We can see, however, also the weakness of the G2 lens. It does it does suffer from focus breathing, and so you can see that the framing is not as tight at 70 millimeters. Now that's not a problem because you're getting a wider, at close focus distance at least, you're getting a wider framing, which is actually useful. It's on the long end where that becomes an issue. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to jump to the long end of the focal range. And so here you can see once again that the G2 lens is not framing nearly as tightly as what the Canon lens is. However, it is delivering twice as much light exposure. And as you can see, looking at these lenses side by side, it's every bit as good at f2.8 as what the Canon is at f4. And that's true right off to the very edges of the frame, where the Tamron actually exhibits a little less of vignette overall, and it looks just as good in terms of resolution and contrast. Now, if we do an apples to apples comparison at f4, we can see that the Tamron is delivering a much more even illumination across the frame. A lot less vignette. It has the advantage of being stopped down. I would say it also shows less pronounced pincushion distortion. You can see a fairly good amount of curvature there. Less with the Tamron. And looking at the overall, sharpness and resolution here at f4, it's not a huge difference, but there's definitely an advantage in the amount of texture and detail that's being rendered by the Tamron lens off of the edge of the frame. Again, it's not by a large margin, but you can see that the Tamron is giving you the more pleasing image, just a little bit better pop and micro contrast there. And that extends right out to the edge of the frame. Now, I realize that not everybody's going to be interested in having an f2.8 lens. And in our first episode, we discussed, how much lighter and smaller a lens like this is, and thus there are certain people that aren't interested in the weight and the heft of an f2.8 lens. But if that's less of a consideration for you, obviously optically the Tamron G2 lens provides similar optical performance, just as good if not better, and of course being able to do that at f2.8, and so that's certainly a consideration. Of course, those of you that follow my reviews know that it's not all about just pure resolution, however. There's a lot more to lens performance than that. And so we're going to take a look at some real-world images and break down how the Canon does when it comes to the aspects that I like to refer to as rendering. Things like the contrast and micro contrast, color rendition, bokeh quality, flare resistance, chromatic aberration control, all of those things that, boil out to how the actual images from a lens looks beyond the resolution. So let's jump in and let's take a look at that. 200 millimeters isn't a huge amount of reach if you're going to do serious, birding or wildlife. So just be prepared that you're probably going to need to crop in some situations. But as we can see here, the contrast is really nice on the image. Detail is great even at 200 millimeter f4. And so, I mean, that's a great looking image. And the nice thing is when you do have a nice lens with high contrast, high resolution, it means that you do have a lot of potential for cropping and still getting a pretty compelling end result. So here, even at a pixel level crop, this is on a 4K monitor, you can see that, there's still lots of detail there if you wanted to crop that deeply. Here is a look kind of again globally. This is at feeder in my backyard, and so first of all, looking at our plane of subject, nice detail, it's sharp focus there, and then looking at the out of focus area, I don't see anything terrible here. Bokeh quality definitely looks pretty decent to me, and then even in some of these bare branches, the lines aren't too hard here. And of course, colors look really good and rich. And of course, this was kind of an overcast kind of setting that helps with color. Nonetheless, I really like the end result of the image. Now here's one that is a little bit closer. And so I've already cropped some into this image. So as you can see, we're cropped down to about 5,000 pixels on the long end at the moment. But once again, you can see we've got great background blur here. But looking at the subject of the bird here, and I know that there are definitely those of you that will use this lens for birding, you can see there in the feathers, lots of fine details, great focus, a very, very nice looking result. One more bird here, and shot from a different kind of angle here. And so looking at the bokeh quality, you can see that you definitely have some kind of lemon or cat eye shapes towards the edge of the frame. Not at all unusual. In the center of the frame, nothing that's too busy, even though some of this is falling in the transition area. But look at the great contrast on our subject. And then if we zoom into a pixel level, that looks really fantastic. Beautiful color, beautiful contrast. This whole thing right here in terms of these colors, the look of the image is something that Canon does very well, and certainly their telephoto and lenses do a great job with this. Looking at our defocus, kind of some of these very bright transition areas, you can see that our amount of fringing is minimal here, and so that's what helps have such great micro contrast. There is very little longitudinal chromatic aberration to be seen here, and that gives us a lot of wide open impact to images. Now, of course, the lens can focus down very close, and as a result, it has a very useful 0.27 times magnification, and that's one area where it's definitely improved over the Mark I of the lens. And so as you can see, even at f4, when you're close to your subject, you can completely blow out a background. In this case, this background is only a few feet away, but as you can see, it's very, very blurred. And then you can also see, looking at a pixel level, there's some nice detail rendered there, and once again, a great looking color from the lens. Now here's one of our foreground things that we just photographed a moment ago. So here is just shooting a little bit further to give you a look, and this is in a planter, and so you've got foreground bokeh, you've got a sharp plane of focus here, good contrast on our subject, and then you see some defocused area here as well. And so once again, there's nothing that particularly jumps out to me as being a negative in terms of the bokeh quality. You know, no hard edges or anything that would be distracting. And so overall, I think that's a pretty decent looking look. Here, once again, if you're, you know, fairly close to a subject, and in this case, not as close as our minimum focus photo, but the background's a little bit further away. And so as you can see, it's a, you know, very creamy background area. And then of course, very nice crisp details all throughout here in the dog's muzzle and tongue and, you know, around the eye. And so, you know, that's a great looking result right there. Now, one area where you do need to watch out is that there's definitely some veiling. I mean, you can see there's a minimal amount of ghosting here, but more importantly, there is some fairly strong veiling, loss of contrast with the sun in the frame. Now, interestingly here, we do get a chance to look at a bokeh circle here, kind of naturally created on the glasses. You can see that in this case, there is a little bit of concentric circles there. This is not necessarily the type of lens we are going to see that kind of thing as often. But anyway, it is something to look out for, as is ghosting is minimal. I'm not concerned about that. But, you know, if you're concerned about veiling, it certainly is present. Here's another image that will show that a bit. And, you know, and in this case, you can see also there's, you know, a little bit of ghosting and some, you know, prismatic kind of effects here. And so, I mean, the image looks great overall. It's just there's going to be some impact if the sun's in the frame. Now, this image, I really thought, of course, you got some great golden hour light here, but it shows the kind of rich color that this lens is capable of. And this image kind of jumped out to me as from the images of the night, just because of how fantastic all of these colors looked. And then, of course, you've got nice detail. I mean, this is shot from, you just kind of saw the amphitheater stands there. So this is shot from that. And so pulling in the subject nice and beautiful rich color. I mean, just really, really nice. So as you can see, I would say that in every one of these metrics, save flare resistance, the new Canon is excellent. And of course, in some ways, flare resistance like that, and not that it was a terrible performance, ghosting was not bad, it's just there's some veiling there, and not the end of the world. But you know, the nice thing about telephoto lenses is that unlike wide angle lenses, flare resistance is a little bit less of an issue because it's far less likely that the angle of view that you're shooting at is going to include the shooting into the sun, and so it's just a less common occurrence. But beyond that, this lens really provides images to me that have a lot of pop when it comes to contrast, micro contrast. Color rendition is beautiful. And so optically, I would say that this lens is doing an exceptional job. And so, I mean, if you're looking at justifying its price tag, I think that in terms of what it delivers optically, its predecessor was a great lens optically. I would say that particularly on the telephoto end, this lens is better yet. The one thing that I think surprised me in this whole comparison was that I expected the Canon to have better light transmission due to growing to a little bit larger of a front element size, and I expected it definitely to compete favorably against the Tamron. It seemed like the opposite was actually true, particularly through 135 millimeters, and so anyway, just interesting conclusion there that was unexpected. Anyway, stay tuned for my final review that is upcoming shortly. And in the meantime, I've added a lot of new images to the image gallery. You can find a link to that down below. You can also find buying links, and as well as all the typical links to follow me on social media, become a patron, sign up for my newsletter, even information there if you're interested in my filming setup. Some of you asked questions about that, and you can find answers to that all down below. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.